Russia never saw this coming. For months, Vladimir Putin's forces had been grinding forward across Ukraine's eastern front, taking village after village through sheer mass and artillery superiority. Then in March 2026, something happened that Moscow's generals are still scrambling to understand. An entire sector of Russia's defensive line, fortified over 2 years of war, collapsed in 72 hours. Not retreated in good order. Not tactically withdrawn. Collapsed. We are talking about a breakthrough that has Russian military bloggers openly questioning whether their command structure has lost control of the battlefield. Welcome to States News. If this is your first time here, subscribe and turn on notifications, because what happened along Ukraine's eastern front represents the kind of tactical innovation that changes how modern wars are fought, and we are covering every dimension of this development that mainstream coverage is missing. I am going to show you exactly how Ukraine pulled off a breakthrough that military analysts are calling the most significant shift in battlefield momentum since the Kharkiv counteroffensive of 2022. We will cover the specific weapon systems that made this possible, the tactical doctrine that Russia failed to adapt to, and the strategic implications that extend far beyond the immediate front lines. We will examine why Russia's defensive strategy, which had worked for 18 months, suddenly failed catastrophically. And by the end, you will understand why this breakthrough represents not just a tactical victory, but a fundamental challenge to Russia's theory of victory in this war. This is not about one battle. This is about whether Russia can maintain defensive lines against an opponent that has solved problems Moscow thought were unsolvable. Let me give you the strategic background that makes this breakthrough genuinely significant, rather than just another shift in a fluctuating front line. Since the failure of Ukraine's 2023 summer offensive, the war had settled into a brutal attritional pattern. Russia held the initiative, advancing slowly but consistently through eastern Donetsk Oblast. The gains were measured in kilometers, sometimes in hundreds of meters, but the direction was clear. Russian forces were grinding forward through numerical superiority and overwhelming artillery advantage. By February 2026, Russia controlled approximately 18% of Ukrainian territory, and that number was growing. The defensive system Russia built across these occupied territories represented 2 years of military engineering. We are talking about multi-layered fortifications modeled on Soviet defensive doctrine, but updated with modern sensor networks and drone coverage. First-line positions with trenches and fighting positions. Second-echelon strongpoints built around concrete bunkers and artillery positions. Third-line reserve areas where counterattack forces could mass without exposure to Ukrainian fire. The system was designed to absorb attacks, channel them into kill zones, and allow Russian artillery to devastate Ukrainian forces before they could consolidate any gains. And for 18 months it worked. Ukraine's challenge was straightforward to describe but extraordinarily difficult to solve. How do you break through prepared defensive positions when your opponent has artillery superiority, air defense that limits your ability to provide close air support, and enough manpower to rotate units through defensive sectors? The traditional answer involves combined arms operations, air superiority, and significant numerical advantage at the point of attack. Ukraine had none of these advantages. They had to find a different answer. Russia's strategic position in early 2026 reflected confidence born of sustained momentum. Defense Minister Andrei Belousov had consolidated control over the military after Shoigu's removal, implementing what Moscow described as systematic improvements in logistics and command structure. Russian military production had ramped up significantly, with artillery shell manufacturing reaching levels that allowed sustained bombardment across multiple sectors simultaneously. The mobilization system, while unpopular domestically, was feeding enough personnel into the meat grinder to sustain offensive operations despite catastrophic casualty rates. From Moscow's perspective, time was on Russia's side. Grind Ukraine down, exhaust Western support, achieve negotiated settlement that locked in territorial gains. Ukrainian forces, meanwhile, were dealing with very real constraints. Ammunition shortages, particularly in artillery shells, had eased somewhat with increased Western production, but still limited Ukraine's ability to match Russian firepower. Manpower challenges were becoming acute after 2 years of intense combat. The average age of Ukrainian soldiers had risen significantly as the initial wave of volunteers was killed or wounded, and mobilization struggled to replace losses. Air defense remained critical but consumable, with Ukraine firing expensive missiles to intercept cheap Russian drones and glide bombs. The strategic picture looked difficult. Ukraine needed to demonstrate that it could still achieve operational success, that Western military aid was producing battlefield results, and that Russia's theory of victory through attrition was not inevitable. Now let me show you exactly what happened along a 40-kilometer section of the front line in northern Donetsk Oblast that has Russian military command desperately trying to understand how their defensive system failed so completely. The breakthrough began not with a massive artillery barrage or armored thrust, but with something far more subtle that Russian forces completely failed to detect until it was too late. Over a period of 6 weeks, Ukrainian forces had been systematically mapping Russian defensive positions using a combination of reconnaissance drones, signals intelligence, and human intelligence from partisan networks operating in occupied territories. They were not just identifying where Russian positions existed. They were cataloging exactly which units occupied which positions, where ammunition was stored, where command posts were located, and critically, where the gaps and weaknesses in Russian sensor coverage existed. This was intelligence preparation of the battlefield conducted with a level of precision that Russian forces had not encountered from Ukraine before. The tactical significance of this intelligence gathering became clear on March 15th, when Ukrainian forces initiated what Russian commanders initially interpreted as a probing attack along a narrow front near the town of Lyman. Small unit actions, limited artillery support, nothing that suggested a major operation. Russian forces responded according to doctrine, reinforcing the threatened sector with reserves from adjacent positions. Standard procedure. Exactly what Ukrainian planners were counting on. Because while Russian attention focused on Lyman, Ukrainian strike units were positioning for attacks on 3 entirely different sectors of the front, chosen specifically because Russian reinforcement doctrine had just stripped them of reserve forces. At 0430 hours on March 17th, Ukrainian forces launched simultaneous assaults on 3 separate locations along a 40-kilometer front. But these were not conventional assaults. Ukrainian forces were employing a tactical approach that combined lessons learned from 2 years of combat with technological innovations that fundamentally changed the calculus of defensive warfare. The initial strikes did not involve infantry at all. Ukrainian forces used modified commercial drones carrying shaped charges to systematically destroy Russian electronic warfare systems, the radar installations and jamming equipment that Russia relied on to detect and disrupt Ukrainian drone operations. Within the first 90 minutes of the operation, Ukrainian forces had created blind spots in Russian sensor coverage across multiple defensive sectors. With Russian electronic warfare degraded, Ukrainian forces deployed what military analysts are calling the most effective tactical innovation of the war so far. Swarms of first-person view FPV drones, operating in coordinated groups of 20 to 30 aircraft, targeted specific elements of Russian defensive positions, not random strikes. Targeted elimination of specific capabilities in a precise sequence. First wave targeted Russian counter-battery radar systems, blinding Russian artillery's ability to detect and respond to Ukrainian fire positions. Second wave hit ammunition storage points that Ukrainian intelligence had identified weeks earlier, triggering massive secondary explosions that destroyed artillery ammunition before it could be fired. Third wave targeted command and control nodes, killing or incapacitating commanders, and destroying communication equipment that Russian forces needed to coordinate defensive response. Let me give you the technical details that explain why this approach proved so devastating. Ukraine has been producing FPV drones domestically at a scale that has reached approximately 100,000 units per month as of March 2026. These are not sophisticated military systems. They are modified racing drones equipped with shaped charges or anti-tank grenades, controlled by operators using commercial video goggles. Individual unit cost is approximately $400 to $800 depending on payload. Compare that to the cost of artillery shells, which run $3,000 for NATO standard 155mm rounds, or guided missiles costing tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars. The economic equation is extraordinary. Ukraine can deploy hundreds of these drones for the cost of a single artillery barrage, and unlike artillery, these drones can adjust their targeting in real time, hunt for specific targets, and achieve precision that conventional fires cannot match. But raw numbers mean nothing without the operational doctrine to employ them effectively, and this is where Ukraine demonstrated genuine innovation. Rather than dispersing drone strikes randomly across the battlefield, Ukrainian forces concentrated drone operations against specific defensive sectors in overwhelming density over compressed time frames. Russian positions that might normally face 10 to 20 drone strikes per day were suddenly receiving 200 to 300 strikes in a 6-hour period. Russian air defense systems, designed to handle dispersed threats, were completely overwhelmed. Shotgun-armed infantry and mobile air defense platforms could not engage targets fast enough. Russian positions were saturated. Now think about what happens when you systematically eliminate an opponent's ability to detect your movements, coordinate defensive fires, and communicate between units. You create conditions for exploitation that have not existed on this battlefield since the early months of the war. Ukrainian mechanized forces, which had been positioned in concealed assembly areas up to 15 kilometers behind the front line, began moving forward through gaps in Russian defensive lines that Ukrainian drones had mapped with precision. They were not advancing blindly. They knew exactly where Russian minefields were located, because drones had identified them. They knew which routes were free of anti-tank obstacles because reconnaissance had mapped every meter of terrain. They moved fast through predetermined corridors while Russian forces struggled to understand what was happening. The strategic implications of this approach extend far beyond the immediate tactical success. What Ukraine demonstrated is that you can break through prepared defensive positions without achieving air superiority, without massive artillery advantage, and without overwhelming numerical superiority at the point of attack. You can do it through precision intelligence, technological innovation at modest cost, and operational doctrine that exploits specific vulnerabilities in your opponent's defensive system. This is genuinely significant because it challenges fundamental assumptions about what is required for successful offensive operations in modern warfare. But let me take you deeper into the second-order effects that military analysts are only beginning to understand. Russia's defensive doctrine relied on the assumption that they could detect and attrite Ukrainian forces before those forces could close with Russian positions. The layered defensive system was designed to impose massive casualties during the approach, making any breakthrough Pyrrhic at best. Ukrainian forces shattered that assumption by making the approach phase nearly invisible to Russian sensors. By the time Russian forces understood they were facing a major assault, Ukrainian units were already inside the defensive perimeter, behind the prepared kill zones, operating in areas where Russian artillery could not fire without hitting their own forces. This breakthrough forced Russia into the kind of fluid mobile combat that their force structure is poorly designed to conduct. Russian units excel at static defense and massed artillery fires from prepared positions. They struggle with rapid maneuver, decentralized decision-making, and combined arms coordination under pressure. Ukrainian forces, by contrast, have spent 2 years developing expertise in exactly this kind of warfare. Small unit operations, rapid adaptation to changing battlefield conditions, exploitation of fleeting opportunities. The tactical advantage shifted decisively once the breakthrough occurred. Within 72 hours of the initial assault, Ukrainian forces had advanced between 8 and 14 kilometers depending on the specific sector, captured 3 strategically significant towns, and forced Russian forces to abandon prepared defensive positions that had taken months to construct. More significantly, Ukraine had created a salient that threatened Russian logistics routes, supporting multiple defensive sectors. Russian forces faced a choice: commit reserves to seal the breach and risk exposing other sectors to similar attacks, or conduct fighting withdrawal to shorter defensive lines and surrender territory that Putin had publicly committed to holding. The economic dimension of this operation deserves attention because it reveals something profound about the trajectory of this war. Ukrainian sources estimated the total cost of the drone strikes that enabled this breakthrough at approximately $12 million. That figure includes the drones themselves, the explosives, the control equipment, and the operational support infrastructure. Compare that to what a conventional offensive operation would require: thousands of artillery shells costing millions of dollars, armored vehicles worth tens of millions, weeks of preliminary bombardment telegraphing your intentions to the enemy. Ukraine achieved a breakthrough for a fraction of the cost and in a fraction of the time that conventional doctrine would require. That economic efficiency has profound implications for sustainability. Ukraine can afford to conduct operations like this repeatedly. Russia can afford to defend against them only by fundamentally restructuring their defensive approach, which requires time and resources they may not possess. Now let me show you the geopolitical consequences that extend far beyond the immediate battlefield. Ukraine's Western partners have been struggling with the question of whether continued military support produces meaningful battlefield results. The failure of the 2023 summer offensive created significant skepticism in Washington and European capitals about Ukraine's ability to achieve operational success against entrenched Russian positions. This breakthrough provides empirical evidence that Ukrainian forces can innovate, adapt, and achieve results that conventional military wisdom suggested were not possible given the constraints they operate under. This matters enormously for the sustainability of Western support. Congressional debates over Ukraine funding have centered on the question of whether we are funding a stalemate or supporting a partner capable of achieving strategic objectives. A breakthrough like this strengthens the argument that Ukraine remains capable of imposing costs on Russia that make continued aggression unsustainable. It demonstrates that innovation and adaptation can compensate for material disadvantages. That narrative supports continued aid appropriations. For Russia, this breakthrough creates a strategic dilemma, with no easy resolution. Putin's theory of victory has relied on the assumption that Russia can sustain attrition longer than Ukraine can, that Western support will eventually waver, and that time favors the larger power with greater resources. Ukraine just demonstrated that this assumption may be wrong. If Ukraine can achieve breakthroughs repeatedly through relatively low-cost drone-centric operations, Russia faces an unsustainable defensive burden. You cannot defend every sector of a 1,000-kilometer front line against saturating drone attacks. You cannot rebuild defensive fortifications as fast as they can be compromised. You cannot replace the tactical advantage that prepared positions provide once your opponent has demonstrated the ability to render those positions untenable. This forces Russia toward difficult choices. Escalate commitment of reserves and resources to prevent further breakthroughs, accepting higher costs and domestic pressure. Negotiate from a position of eroding military advantage. Or adapt their own defensive doctrine to counter drone-centric operations, which requires technological and tactical innovations that Russia has shown limited capacity to generate under wartime conditions. Let me shift now to discuss what this operation has not accomplished and what limitations remain, because intellectual honesty requires acknowledging that tactical successes do not automatically translate into strategic victory. This breakthrough, significant as it is, represents gains measured in kilometers across a narrow front. We are talking about 8 to 14 kilometers of advance in an optimal sector, not a general collapse of Russian defensive positions across the entire theater. Russia still controls approximately 18% of Ukrainian territory. Russian forces still possess significant reserves, artillery superiority in most sectors, and the basic numerical advantage that comes from being a much larger country. One successful operation does not end a war. Ukrainian forces also face very real sustainability questions. The drone production capacity that made this operation possible is impressive, but not unlimited. Ukraine is producing approximately 100,000 FPV drones per month, but combat consumption is also extraordinarily high. Defensive operations against Russian attacks consume tens of thousands of drones monthly. Offensive operations like this breakthrough can burn through thousands of drones in days. The production consumption balance is manageable currently, but not comfortable. Any disruption to domestic production facilities or component supply chains could rapidly constrain operational capacity. The personnel challenges that constrained Ukrainian operations before this breakthrough have not disappeared. Ukraine still faces manpower shortages that limit their ability to hold territory once captured, rotate units for rest and reconstitution, and maintain defensive positions across the entire front. A successful offensive creates new demands for troops to garrison captured territory, defend extended supply lines, and exploit opportunities that emerge. Ukraine may lack sufficient manpower to capitalize fully on tactical successes. Russia's perspective on this breakthrough also deserves consideration. From Moscow's viewpoint, this represents a tactical setback, not a strategic defeat. Russian military bloggers and nationalist commentators have criticized the command decisions that allowed the breakthrough, but they frame it as correctable failure rather than systemic crisis. Russia has demonstrated repeatedly throughout this war that it will accept catastrophic casualties and tactical defeats if doing so serves the political objective of holding territory and exhausting Ukrainian resistance. There is no indication that a breakthrough of this scale fundamentally changes Putin's calculus about the war's trajectory. Russian forces are also capable of adaptation. The drone threat that proved so decisive in this operation is not unknown to Russian commanders. Russia has its own drone programs, its own experience defending against Ukrainian drone strikes, and the technical capacity to develop countermeasures. Expect to see increased deployment of electronic warfare systems specifically designed to counter FPV drones, more sophisticated air defense integration, and tactical adjustments to dispersal and camouflage that make target identification more difficult. Ukraine's tactical advantage in this domain is real but not permanent. The question of whether Ukraine can repeat this success at scale also remains open. This operation targeted a specific sector where intelligence preparation was extensive and where Russian defensive weaknesses could be identified and exploited. Replicating this across multiple sectors simultaneously requires intelligence collection capacity, drone stockpiles, and trained personnel that may not exist in sufficient quantities. Ukraine may be capable of conducting operations like this episodically, rather than continuously, which limits their strategic impact. What we are watching is the evolution of modern warfare in real time, and this breakthrough represents a genuine inflection point in that evolution. Ukraine has demonstrated that relatively inexpensive technology, deployed with precision and integrated into coherent operational doctrine, can overcome defensive advantages that conventional wisdom suggested were insurmountable. That lesson will be studied in military academies and incorporated into planning by armed forces worldwide. For Ukraine specifically, this operation provides both immediate tactical gains and proof of concept for a sustainable approach to offensive operations. They have shown they can break through Russian lines without requiring the massive Western weapon systems that political constraints have limited. They have demonstrated innovation capacity that justifies continued support from partners, questioning whether aid produces results. And they have imposed costs on Russia that challenge Putin's theory of victory through attrition. For Russia, This breakthrough exposes vulnerabilities in their defensive system that will be extraordinarily difficult to remedy while maintaining offensive pressure in other sectors. You cannot simultaneously defend everywhere, attack in priority areas, and regenerate forces depleted by 2 years of combat. Russia faces a resource allocation problem with no comfortable solution. Every drone defense system deployed to prevent breakthroughs is a system not available for offensive operations. Every reserve unit committed to sealing penetrations is a unit unavailable for exploitation elsewhere. The broader strategic picture remains complex and uncertain. Ukraine has demonstrated capability to achieve tactical success, but not yet the capacity to translate those successes into territorial liberation at scale. Russia retains significant military capacity but faces an opponent that continues to innovate faster than Russian systems can adapt. Western support remains critical but politically fragile, dependent on demonstrable progress that operations like this provide, but that must be sustained over time to maintain funding. What to watch for in coming weeks will tell us whether this breakthrough represents a temporary tactical success or the beginning of a broader shift in battlefield momentum. Can Ukraine repeat this operation in other sectors? How quickly does Russia adapt its defensive doctrine to counter drone saturation tactics? Do Ukrainian forces possess sufficient reserves to exploit the breach they have created, or will Russian reinforcements seal the penetration before strategic gains can be consolidated? These questions will determine whether March 2026 is remembered as the month Ukraine solved Russia's defensive system or merely as another fluctuation in a protracted conflict. One thing is certain. The war has entered a new phase where technological innovation and tactical adaptation matter as much as raw firepower and troop numbers. Ukraine has shown they can compete effectively in that environment. Russia must now prove they can adapt quickly enough to prevent further breakthroughs, and history suggests that adaptation is not a strength of Russian military bureaucracy. If this analysis helped you understand why this breakthrough matters beyond the immediate tactical picture, subscribe and turn on notifications. We are covering every development in this rapidly evolving situation, and the next phase of Ukraine's operations is already in motion. The story of how modern warfare is being rewritten is happening right now, and we are watching all of it in real time.